having to do with crimes. And we also have another session that'll be an outside, actually a vendor, who is going to be talking about education data that they reap from the public available data, consolidate, and then use to support districts in their efforts to forecast where they're going to be in 5 years. So the session will have actually multiple value to you. One is it might point out to you what you need to be careful about when you post data to the web, because other people take advantage of it and can do things with it. But it also gives an opportunity to see what can be done with broadly available public data by people who are dedicated to doing something interesting with it. It's also kind of interesting that they're using Tableau for all their displays, and it's kind of fun to see what they're doing with that. It's some sophisticated work. So I'll look forward to that session, and you can, I hope, as well. Next up, however, we have Tasha Chapman and Karen, I don't know nobody has last names. What's your last name? Howard. Karen Howard, yes, Karen Howard. There it is.
See.
Oh, and Karen, yes, and James Burke. They're going to be talking about, the title is, as it says, Mourn for the Dead, Fight for the Living, talking about what happens with data and how we use it to deal with on-the-job injuries and deaths and things like that, right? Yeah, no. Anyway, we don't ever want to hear about those, though, right? Anyway, but I'm glad somebody's paying attention. So Tasha is a research analyst in the Central Services Division of the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services. She's lead analyst in support of the Oregon OSHA and Workers' Compensation System. Been an employee of the state of Oregon since 2005 and previously worked with Oregon Health Authority and the Department of Human Services. So she's been around a bit. She received a master's degree from the...
It's an interesting way of putting it, but yes,
yes,
I have.
She has broad experience. We'll call it broad experience. How's that? Master's degree from the University of California, Riverside in personality psychology research with an emphasis on personality assessment and psychometrics. She actually is also planning to be hosting a survey research class coming up soon. You may have heard about that in a recent email. She's really brilliant, so fun to listen to, too. She's very good at presenting. Karen is a research analyst, and you can stand and let people see who you are. Karen Howard is a research analyst in the Central Services Division, the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services, DCBS. That's one of those acronyms you know, but you don't know what it stands for exactly, but you know it's over at DCBS.
That's us.
Anyway, her primary area of expertise is with occupational injury and illness data, hence the topic of today, including Oregon workers' compensation claims. She's been with DCBS for 15 years and has led and participated in numerous analytical projects and studies related to occupational injuries and illnesses. In addition to informing agency policy decisions, her work is used by employers, workers, researchers, and others in accident prevention. Both of these young people, in fact, are on the executive committee and have been for some time, and you should acknowledge that as well. It's really nice that they're willing to commit their time to making sure these things happen. I appreciate their work. Tasha's been running the thing forever. If it weren't for Tasha and a meeting in this very room about 3 years ago, we wouldn't be doing this today, so it's worthy of acknowledgement. James, are you James? This is James, I thought so. Is a research analyst in Central Services Division at the Oregon Department of Consumer and Business Services. Once again, DCBS. Prior to career in public service, James worked in a number of dangerous jobs from meat packing to bridge construction and worked for many years as a warehouseman. I'm sorry, James. But I see you still have all 10 fingers. That's a good thing. I myself worked in sheet metal for a while and counted my fingers at the end of the day each day and said, yep, all 10. And after a year gave that up because I was tired of counting my fingers. Mm-hmm. I was really risking losing them. That was the concern. In 10 years working in the state of Oregon, he's worked for Oregon Health Authority's Public Health Division, where he worked primarily with birth and death certificate data. James currently at DBS includes supporting OSHA and Workers' Compensation Division and the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics through occupational fatality data and working with Oregon workers' compensation claims data. This is kind of morbid.
It's kind of what we do, yeah.
It's kind of morbid what you do.
Right?
I myself work in high school improvement, and I'm pretty happy to be, but I'm glad that somebody does what you do. Anyway, James has a master's degree from South Dakota State University in sociology. He's also done graduate work at the University of Kansas. Welcome, Tasha, Karen, and James, and their presentation, Workplace Fatalities in Oregon, which isn't quite titled that in there.
Thank you. So I realized through that presentation, I probably should give you like a really super brief introduction to what DCBS is, because that's where you are. Welcome to DCBS. We are kind of one of those sort of unknown agencies, but yet at the same time, I think you kind of know a lot of our work. We are the largest regulatory agency in the state, and our umbrella is actually really broad. So we include Oregon OSHA, Workers' Compensation Division, so a lot of occupational safety and health stuff that we're going to talk about today. We also have the Division of Financial Regulation. The health insurance marketplace is here as well now. And a whole bunch of other things that it's just way too much to think about. So that's kind of what we do. We have a research unit that kind of helps support the entire agency as a whole, of which Karen and James and I are part of. And this is some of the work that we do related to occupational safety and health, specifically surveilling and preventing workplace fatalities. So that's why we're here. So workplace fatalities happen all across the nation and all across the world, of course, and it's actually a pretty significant issue, and probably for those of you who don't look at this stuff day after day, it's a much larger issue than I think most people realize. So this is a graphic from AFL-CIO based off of a report that they do every year, which is based primarily off of a lot of the federal statistics that we're going to talk about today. But they say, as you can see from the graphic, you've got 150 U.S. workers who die every day due to workplace accidents and illnesses. So it's a pretty significant issue that is happening around the world. Here at the agency, there's a lot of different ways that we look at workplace fatalities and a lot of different ways that we address this issue. So we're going to be talking about all of these today. And kind of how they all intersect and how they're the same and how they're different. And then throughout all of that, Ms. Karen Howard will also give you guys some actual case studies. So you guys can actually kind of hear a little bit of the personal stories, because at the end of the day, I mean, there's a lot of numbers, but it's really all about people. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first thing I wanted to talk about, first program I wanted to talk about is the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries. The Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries is a program that is actually run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a federal agency. They grant us money to run this program on their behalf, and they do that with a number of different states, but it's actually a federal program that's done nationwide. And it was really a response to some of the other programs that they do. They have another program called the Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illnesses, where they actually do a survey of employers and collect information from a random selection of employers on the injuries that they have and the illnesses that they have at the workplace. And back in the day, this survey has been going on for decades. Back in the day, that was also how they collected information on fatalities. However, fatalities, there are many of them, of course, and way too many of them. But statistically speaking, it's still a relatively rare event. And so they realized that back in 1982, that using the survey method was not an appropriate way to actually collect information on fatalities, and certainly was not enough of a comprehensive way of collecting information about what was actually happening. So in '92, they started the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, which is truly a census. We collect information on all fatalities that happen within this. In here, for Oregon, we collect information on all fatalities that happen within the state of Oregon. The basic definition of a person who's included in CFOI is essentially someone who has an established working relationship and who dies, basically, for all intents and purposes. So it's a pretty inclusive count of fatalities. And Karen's going to talk a lot about one such fatality.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So most of the people I work with aren't alive. So this will be interesting to talk to people that still are. My job is really interesting. I'll start with that. But it does get kind of sensitive. These are real people, and they have families, and they have lives before this happens. So just a warning, if anyone is real sensitive to that, you might some of these cases might be hard to listen to. So one thing about CFOI that's special is that it counts suicides at work. Workers' comp would not cover that normally. A lot of the other programs don't cover that. So it's special in that way because there's just really no other count for that. When we do our new program, we won't be counting that either. But this is an example, and I couldn't use the real example because CFOI is confidential. So I just made a hypothetical example. An accountant working for a large CPA firm goes to work on Friday. She's laid off on Friday morning. Friday afternoon, she goes to the staff restroom and overdoses on narcotics. That's a suicide at work, intentional overdose. That would be counted for CFOI. So that's just kind of an interesting case where you know, it might not even be work-related. I mean, she could be having personal problems. She could be having other issues, financial issues, but this would be counted on CFOI. Likewise, there could be suicides that are because of work that happen at home. They don't happen in the workplace. You know, maybe someone's stressed out because they have to present at work or something. You never know. So those ones would not get counted because they don't happen in the work environment. So that's just an overview of CFOI case.
So on the screen, we have some statistics from the national data. And so you can see there has been a little bit of a drop over time since '92 when we first started counting fatalities using the CFOI program. So back in 1992, the count was about 6,200 fatalities per year. Now in most recent years, we're looking at about 5,000 to 5,100. That's kind of a weird statement. 5,100 fatalities per year. So there has definitely been a little bit of decline, which is good. A recent uptake recently, some of that's due to economic factors and changes in industry mix and so on and so forth that will affect both the ups and downs, and some of them will do with you know, safety prevention efforts. So like I said, CFOI is a federal program. We kind of deal with the information for Oregon. And I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what we do to do that. So the first step in kind of our process for data collection for CFOI is notification of the fatality. And there's actually a lot of different ways that we basically scour all available resources to figure out if a person has died in a work-related setting. One of the number one sources of notification is a death certificate, actually. You may not be aware of this, but the death certificate does actually have a box on it called at work that the medical examiner will check if the death may be work-related. And those particular death certificates will actually come to us as a first notification of a fatality. That at work box is very, very useful, but not 100% accurate. So we clearly use many other data sources as well to try to supplement that. So incident reports, so for example, if a fatality is reported to Oregon OSHA, then we receive information about that. Workers' compensation claim filings is another way that we get information. News reports, we spend a lot of time setting up Google alerts and other news alerts to try to find any particular work-related fatalities that may be out there. And then sometimes we're notified through other programs or even other states in the CFOI system. Sometimes some of those fatalities will kind of cross state borders, and so we'll work together with other states to kind of work that out and make sure that we are each notified of the particular fatality. So as I mentioned, this is a little hard to read probably from the back, but a kind of a very brief copy of a blank death certificate. In fact, it's only a partial. This actually is a pretty long form, and there's a lot of information that's actually captured here. So we have information about whether the decedent was of a Hispanic origin, their birthplace, particularly if they were, which is of interest to us, particularly if it was a foreign birthplace. There's a lot of information about their occupation, their industry, and definitely how they died. So a lot of these data sources have some very, very useful information in them. Oops, there we go. Once we are notified of a fatality, then we begin the work of actually investigating that and collecting as many documents as we possibly can. So in addition to some of the other documents that I talked about before, we'll also collect things like medical examiner reports, DMV crash reports, any accident investigation reports that might be out there from agencies that are responsible for doing those kinds of investigations. I did want to note specifically the medical examiner reports because those are incredibly useful to us. The CFOI program, unlike some of the other surveillance programs that we're going to talk about today, as Karen mentioned, is very inclusive and includes a lot of fatalities that may not be covered by other agencies. One of the ways that it's inclusive is that it includes any kind of working relationship, whether it's a formal working relationship, an informal working relationship, whether it's a self-employed worker, anything of that nature. And some of those particular working relationships aren't covered by, say, Oregon OSHA or the Mining Safety and Health Administration. And so the medical examiner can sometimes be the only person, the only source of information we have about how that person died and what was the nature of that working relationship. Now, you might think that those are pretty rare and few and far between, but actually they're really not. For example, we have a lot of cases that come across our desk that are perhaps a farmer working on a small family farm. They have no employees, so therefore they're not under Oregon OSHA jurisdiction. They're not covered by workers' comp. And so the only information that we have about that particular fatality usually comes from that medical examiner report. So yeah, you'd just be really surprised to see exactly how many of those types of cases there are. One of the things we do, obviously, is we're collecting all of this information, all of these source documents, is we try to compile it so that we can actually use it for analysis. So part of that is determining kind of a scope determination, whether or not this case actually is applicable and should be falls within the parameters of the CFOI program. So that's determining what was that work relationship, determining whether that death is related to that work relationship, things of that nature. We also do coding, of course, as I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with, because but we also write a lot of case narratives, and there's a federal review process as well, where BLS employees will actually go over all of the data, do necessary edits and checks, and review everything before it's finalized and included as part of the CFOI final reports. There's a lot of different data elements that we capture, and this very graphic and yet really teeny tiny font slide is really just kind of meant to represent the fact that there's a lot of different pieces of information that we capture, and this certainly is not all inclusive. But as I mentioned before, we include things such as race and ethnicity, industry, occupation, how the person died, and any kind of contributing factors that we may be able to capture that surround the death. So for example, if it happens to be a motor vehicle accident, we'll capture information about whether or not they were wearing a seatbelt, what was the weather conditions, that kind of thing. So anything that we can use eventually as part of the analysis and eventually part of the safety and health prevention efforts. The Bureau of Labor Statistics will actually publish a lot of different reports every year. If you go to bls.gov, you can actually see the federal reports as well as some reports for different state programs. And a lot of it is some pretty high-level aggregate information. And it's really useful, obviously, for getting an overall look of kind of what is the state of things within the nation and within individual states. That being said, the CFOI program does have some drawbacks for us as researchers. One of the biggest drawbacks is that this is actually federally owned data. And as many of you in the room may be familiar with being part of federal programs, sometimes you know that when you are the conduit, we do this on behalf of BLS, but the data does not actually belong to us. It goes into a federal system, and the actual data belongs to them. So we are limited in what we can actually use and analyze to basically the high-level aggregate published data that BLS publishes. We don't actually have access to any of the line item data ourselves. So, oh yeah.
Or is it not yours until you have put it in their conduits?
So the question is, does the data become theirs because it goes into their data system, or is it theirs beforehand? And the answer is actually it's theirs beforehand. It's part of the data sharing agreements that we have with the agencies that share information with us. So the data sharing agreements we have with OHA, for example, to receive the death certificates, the data sharing agreements we have with the state of police and the medical examiner's office to receive those documents, really at this time are for CFOI purposes. And so the data actually does belong to the feds in that sense, in the sense that we can only use it for that purpose. So that is, again, like I said, a pretty big drawback. The other thing that I should note is that one of the rules of the CFOI program is that we cannot, specifically, it's listed out in our protocols, that we cannot share information with health and safety enforcement agencies. So for example, if we happen to know of a case that perhaps should have been reported to Oregon OSHA and never was, we cannot legally share that information with Oregon OSHA, which for those of us who work with Oregon OSHA every single day, as you can imagine, this is very difficult for us. So that is definitely, a drawback to the program. It's important for the program, of course, but for us from where we sit, it's definitely a drawback. So, yeah, let's see. Oh, a couple other things that I wanted to mention about the CFOI program. The data that's published from CFOI is usually published. It takes a while for data maturation, obviously. So right now, if you go to the CFOI website, you'll see the 2016 numbers are up. The 2017 numbers probably won't come up until the fall of this year. Is that correct? December? Did you say December? Oh yeah, so December. So as you can see, there's quite a long maturation phase. Also, CFOI does not include illnesses. It only counts injuries. Part of that is because of the fact that it just takes so long and is so difficult to create that establishment of a relationship between the illness and the work relationship. So for that reason, they've basically limited it to only injuries. And also, even though there is that part of the reason why there's that really late data maturation period is because they want to make sure they capture as many cases as possible. But that being said, if a case does happen to come up after the data period is closed, they don't go back and add late cases. So it is possible that every year a couple cases could be missed just because of the length of time it takes to get notified and to investigate. So with that, I wanted to talk about a couple of the other surveillance programs that we're involved with. The FACE program, the Fatality Assessment and Control Evaluation Program, is actually a program that's run through NIOSH, and they actually have a grant with OHSU to do the FACE program. So this isn't a program that DCBS runs directly or is specifically involved with, but certainly they're a partner agency, and so we work with them as much as we can because we do very similar work. So, Karen, you want to talk a little bit about FACE?
Sure. Okay, so here's another case study for you to look over. This is an example of a FACE case that they counted. So this was a crane operator who was trying to erect a 40-foot steel beam. It was about 5,600 pounds, so it was very, very large, about 40 feet long. And as it was erected vertically, it broke. So the top of the thing broke and the entire beam fell onto his cab, which you can see was nearly sliced in half. So he died of blunt force head injuries. FACE investigations, like you can look on the web and see this investigation, they're very thorough. So they include a very thorough narrative in minute detail, but then they also include recommendations for safety. So I think they're really useful. The only drawback of a FACE report is that there's a delay in them publishing. So this case, for example, happened, I think, in the beginning of 2016, and it was well into 2017 before the information was out there to use. So that's an example of a FACE case.
So as I mentioned before, the Oregon FACE program is sponsored through NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is another federal agency that's actually part of the CDC. The Oregon FACE program, run through OHSU, receives a grant from NIOSH to do that work. The inclusion criteria and the surveillance system that FACE uses is very, very similar to CFOI in terms of definitions. And so generally speaking, the counts from year to year are actually very similar, if not almost exactly alike. Any differences are usually due to the fact that they are two separate programs that do not talk to each other because of federal regulations and confidentiality purposes. But by and large, we're generally doing the same, we're working down the same path, kind of doing the same thing with the same goal. As Karen mentioned, though, one of the other things about the FACE program is they do have pretty exhaustive investigative reports that they put out, and that's available on the web. And they also have their annual reports that they put out as well. One of the other things that they do is they work really closely with other agencies, such as OHA and public health, and really kind of work towards an ultimate goal of prevention. And so they put out other documents and hazard alerts and other materials that can be used by safety and health professionals. So now I want to talk a little bit about another program that we have here at DCBS. As I mentioned, we are granted through BLS to run the CFOI program, but because of the limitations that we've had with the CFOI program, that's traditionally not been the main source of information that we use within the agency for a lot of our actual reporting of fatalities across the state. What we actually have used traditionally for many, many years is workers' compensation claims data. So one of the other agencies, or the other divisions that we have here at DCBS is the Workers' Compensation Division. And we receive information from insurers, workers' comp insurers, of workers' comp claims that are classified as disabling claims, essentially meaning a person has been away from work for 3 or more days as a result of their injury. Part of that also is fatality claims. And so we've used that information about the number of fatality claims that happen every year to kind of get a sense of where we are as a state in terms of occupational safety and health. Now, there's some pretty stark differences between workers' comp and CFOI, which we'll talk about a little bit. But one of the biggest differences, obviously, is that inclusion criteria of who gets counted in that particular count, right? So for workers' comp claims, what we're really talking about is we're talking about just employees, so a standard employer-employee relationship. So those self-employed workers and other informal relationships wouldn't be included. And they're ones that have actually been accepted for workers' compensation benefits. And there's a lot of reasons why that may be different than some of the other distinctions we might make for some other programs. So before we get, Karen, you want to talk a little bit about workers' comp?
Sure. Okay, just to add to that, workers' comp is our smallest bucket, if you will, of fatalities because, again, someone decided that this was compensable and that it would count towards a work-related fatality. So we can even have a denied fatal claim that we ultimately decide is work-related and maybe put into a different bucket. But definitely this is our smallest. So everyone remembers the 2015 Umpqua Community College shooting. This was Professor Lawrence Levine. He was teaching a class at the time, and he was the first person killed by the gunman. So he was also a student, or the gunman was a student of this professor, and walked straight in and shot him first. He was killed instantly. So I'm sure we all still remember that. That was actually an accepted workers' comp claim, for good reason. There's a few other facts about this case that, of course, as we drill down to the details of trying to work on preventive stuff that maybe the general public doesn't know, and I thought you might find them interesting. The entire incident, from the time the gunman entered the building until he took his own life by shooting himself, was about 10 minutes. It lasted 10 minutes. In that entire event, 10 people died. So that's, you could say, a person a minute. It was just a massacre. The shooter was armed with 6 weapons. 5 of them were handguns, and 1 was a long gun. The long gun was not used in the shootings, but for whatever reason, but he definitely used the 6 handguns. He would have killed and injured more people, it's likely, if U.S. Army veteran Chris Mintz had not tried to prevent him from leaving the classroom. So in that effort to prevent him from leaving that classroom, he was shot 7 times and survived, somehow miraculously survived that shooting. So, hopefully that helped a little bit for what he went through. The shooter engaged in a 2-minute shootout with police outside of the classroom before re-entering the classroom and, as I said before, taking his own life by shooting himself. In all, 9 students, that includes the shooter, and the professor lost their lives in that shooting. So that was an accepted workers' comp claim that I thought was a good example of their family getting compensation and benefits for that tragedy. Thank you.
Workers' compensation system in Oregon has been going on for many, many years, decades. And so we actually have information and estimates of the number of work-related fatalities that are part of the workers' compensation system. So if you can see from this pretty large, long lens of history, we've actually done quite a bit of work in reducing the number of fatalities year after year. So in 1943, which is the earliest data that we have, we had about 162 work-related fatalities that were covered by the workers' compensation system. And by 2016, that number was down to 29. The 2017 number, which is published today, is 35. So as you can see, it's a pretty significant drop over the decades. And that drop has been pretty consistent over the years. There's been a couple reasons for that drop, though. Some of those reasons have to do with safety and health prevention efforts, the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration that goes with that act, of course, workplace enforcement and inspections to enforce workplace safety and health laws, definitely had a very significant impact on the number of fatalities. That being said, workers' compensation is an insurance system, and so it has its own rules and regulations related to which types of claims are accepted and which types of claims are not, right? And so there's those policy decisions that are separate from some of the prevention efforts that we're really trying to target towards. And sometimes it can be very difficult to tease those two apart. That being said, I will say that some of the policy decisions that affect perhaps the number of injuries that you see every year that are workers' comp claims injuries, some of those policy decisions don't necessarily affect fatal injuries quite to the same degree. I mean, a fatality is a fatality is a fatality. It may be a little difficult to determine whether a back injury is work-related or not, and the determination that goes with it can be pretty nuanced, and policy decisions can affect that quite significantly as to whether one year that claim is accepted and perhaps the next year that claim is not. But with fatal injuries, obviously you don't have that same issue. That being said, there are things that can cause a fatal injury to not be an accepted claim. For example, if a claimant has a positive tox screen at the time of the injury, then that can actually be enough to cause the claim to be denied. So there are, again, policy decisions and insurance-related decisions that can affect this number that are outside of what we're really focusing on, which is really safety and health and fatality prevention.
Can I ask a question on that?
Absolutely.
That's like tied to the decline of the ticker.
That is an excellent point, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that because I had it in my head and it slipped right out while I was talking about policies. That's another thing that's definitely made a difference here when we're talking about changes over time is the industrial makeup. And this is something we see nationally and, of course, locally as well, the industrial makeup. So, and I'm sure there are some economists and people from the employment department who can speak to this even more than I can, but there's definitely been a pretty significant shift away from some of the more dangerous industries, such as logging, forestry, and towards some of the quote-unquote safer industries, at least when we're talking about fatalities, such as the service sector and retail and so on and so forth. So yes, that has definitely been a pretty significant role as well in what we're looking at. The information that we collect on workers' comp claims, we also produce a wide number of reports here at the agency on these. So we produce information similar to what you might see from some of the CFOI reports, such as aggregate counts of how the worker died, what was the industry that they were working in, what was the occupation that they were working in, things of that nature. We also, again, because this is our data, we have more flexibility in what we can actually publish. This is a report that's actually available on the web, so you can actually pull up case narratives of fatalities that have happened across the state, which can be really useful for safety and health professionals as they're trying to learn more about what caused some of these fatalities and how to prevent them in the future. That being said, if you look at the differences between CFOI and the workers' compensation system, as I've kind of alluded to before, there's pretty significant differences in the two counts from year after year. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. One of them has to do with kind of how we count things. CFOI will count things based on the year that the person died. For the workers' compensation claims data, we actually count that based on when the claim is accepted. Most times that's the same year, but depending on how long that insurance process happens or when the person actually dies, like for example, if they die in December, the claim may not be accepted until January or February of the next year. So that's one reason why there's big differences. But some of the other reasons really kind of have to do with that inclusion-exclusion criteria. Yeah? Oops.
Something like that, is that right?
Yeah, that's just a straight count of fatalities per year. So this is just Oregon data. Earlier I'd showed some national data. This is just data here in Oregon. So for example, in the workers' compensation system, in 1992, we had 63 fatalities. In 2016, we had 29. By comparison, the CFOI program counted 89 work-related fatalities in 92 and 72 fatalities in 2016. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main reasons, though, for why those counts are so different really has to do with that inclusion-exclusion criteria. Who do you count in which program? So for example, CFOI is not tied in any way, shape, or form to workers' compensation claims, benefits, or insurance, and so they don't really care about whether or not a claim was accepted or denied. They're going to include it if there is an established working relationship. They're also going to include employees and workers who maybe aren't subject to the workers' compensation system. So as I mentioned before, this is going to include things like self-employed workers, contractors, independent farmers, also some carve-outs that you might not expect, such as the City of Portland Police and Fire. They actually cover their workers' comp benefits through their disability fund rather than through our workers' comp system. So they're traditionally not included in part of our workers' comp system, but they are included in some of our other surveillance programs. The workers' compensation system, however, and the claims data that we capture will include things that may not necessarily be included in some of the CFOI counts. So for example, we're going to include illnesses, which is, as I mentioned before, the CFOI does not. We also will include workers who are covered through Oregon workers' comp, even if they're injured outside of the state of Oregon. Now for CFOI, if they're injured in another state, then that just means they're counted by another state. But there also are occasional times where there are Oregon workers who are actually injured outside of the country. So actually a couple years ago, there was an incident that involved a lot of Oregon workers actually down in another country. So that's something that workers' comp is going to count, but CFOI is not. So as you can imagine, there's differences in how we count things, differences in how we look at things, and that makes some pretty significant differences in what the data looks like. Yeah, absolutely. Military personnel generally are not included in either program. They're not included in the workers' compensation system because they're not covered by workers' comp insurance when they're on active duty or as part of their military. CFOI occasionally will include military personnel if they happen within the state of Oregon, which I've actually seen a couple cases of that nature. So yes, those will happen. So when we look year over year, there are pretty stark differences between these two surveillance programs, which can certainly be difficult to explain to people who don't understand the nuances of our data, and can also create some questions, even from policymakers, as to why there is this big difference. And one of the difficulties that we always had as analysts is that it was really hard for us to actually provide a good answer for why there were differences. I mean, we could talk in broad terms about different inclusion and exclusion criteria and things like that, but we really couldn't say specifically about why there were specific cases that were included in one and not the other. And we also couldn't talk very much about why there were differences in the differences over years, right? Why one year the difference was slight, whereas the next year the difference might be pretty significantly huge. And that's just because the CFOI data, as we mentioned before, isn't ours. We can't do that line item analysis to really look and see why a particular case is included in one and not the other. So for that reason, we are actually embarking on a new surveillance program here at the agency, which we're calling, for now, Oregon Workplace Fatalities. That will actually have an inclusion criteria that's very similar to something like the CFOI program or the FACE program. So we're not looking just at our own jurisdiction. We're just looking at workplace fatalities across the state as a whole. And hopefully this will give us a better picture of what's actually happening in the state and will give us more information that we can use to prevent fatalities in the future. Karen, I'm going to toss it over to you for a second.
Okay, thank you. I just realized I'm always talking about the depressing stuff. It's like, everybody's always... Okay, so this is a good example of why we wanted to make a new program that was more inclusive. This was a case where, in Portland, where this is an actual picture of the back of the restaurant. This man was painting for the restaurant owner the back of that restaurant. He was up on the scaffold periodically to paint that part of it. What you cannot see is that restaurant abuts an embankment that goes down into a stream, river, creek, small waterway. John Grant, Mr. Grant, was a homeless person who worked for the restaurant owner occasionally for $10 an hour, but he paid him in food. So there wasn't really money changing hands. It was more like, here's your dinner, how much did you get done, kind of thing. For that reason, it went out of scope for a lot of the different programs because there wasn't this formal employer-employee relationship. Well, Oregon OSHA thought there was enough of one that they would do an investigation because there was remuneration changing hands. So when they did their investigation, they just couldn't find enough evidence to say he was up on the scaffold when he fell, he was painting when he fell. So they just couldn't find that work activity piece of it enough to say there's a penalty, it's work related. So they ended up closing the investigation without issuing any citations or anything. So this case would only end up, it's not covered by workers' comp. It may or may not end up in CFOI because of the employer-employee relationship blurred, but it definitely would end up in our new program of Oregon Workplace Fatalities. So in that way, it's good because then we can identify these gray areas and these gaps that we aren't capturing in other programs. So, thank you.
So just talking a little bit about this new program that we're embarking on. As we mentioned before, we're going to be talking about workplace fatalities within the state of Oregon and Oregon workers that are injured on the job. So it's going to be regardless of whether or not they're subject to workers' comp benefits, regardless of whether they're under Oregon OSHA jurisdiction or not. The idea is we want to be as inclusive as possible and create some comprehensive data that we can use. The data collection, the process that we're going to use is pretty similar to what we do with CFOI. We actually have new data sharing agreements with those agencies that now allow us to use that data for our own purposes as well. So that's really great. We now have that access to that data now as an agency as opposed to just for the purposes of the federal program. And we're going to collect the same amount of comprehensive information as we would with the CFOI program. The other great thing about this is that now we can actually use this information on not just a macro level for research purposes, but also on a micro level with some of our other divisions within the agency. So for example, as I mentioned before, we had the issue with CFOI that if we're collecting something on behalf of CFOI that we can't report that to Oregon OSHA, even if it's something that they should legally know about. If we collect something now for the purposes of our Oregon Workplace Fatalities and under those data sharing agreements, we now do have the ability to share that with Oregon OSHA, which is great. One of the other things that we can do as well is the agency has an ombudsman for injured workers. And so now if we come across a particular fatal injury that we think possibly should be eligible for workers' compensation benefits but didn't file a claim for whatever reason, we can report that to the ombudsman and she can look into it and do further investigation to see if perhaps there really should have been a claim filed on behalf of that family. The other thing that we can do is obviously more research, which is great. And so we're kind of brainstorming now that we have this, we're going to have more data and access to more information. What are kind of some of the things that we want to do and what do we want to look at? And then, of course, ultimately, the reason that we do that research is to look and see if there are certain policies that should be changed. Are there classifications of workers that maybe aren't traditionally under our jurisdiction that we might want to include? Or are there particular types of incidents or injuries that we're not spending enough time focusing on that we should be looking at, and hazards that are not being adequately addressed? Speaking of hazards that haven't traditionally been very well addressed, transportation accidents. This is actually the #1 cause of work-related fatalities, as well as the #1 cause of fatal accidents even outside of the workplace. Transportation accidents consist of a very significant number of fatalities every year. However, traditionally, federal OSHA and many of the state plans that are under federal OSHA do not investigate transportation accidents because often they happen outside of the workplace, and so there was a policy decision made to not investigate transportation accidents. That being said, years ago, Oregon OSHA made the decision that because of the fact that there was such a significant portion of fatalities in the state, that we would investigate fatality or transportation accidents and that they would fall under the Oregon OSHA purview. Logging fatalities, another area that's definitely of interest to us in the state because logging is still a pretty significant industry for us. There are relatively few employees in Oregon that still do logging, but they make up a very significant portion of the fatal injuries and the non-fatal injuries for that matter in the state. And usually those injuries are very severe. So For that reason, this is obviously an area of focus for us here in the state. We actually have a specific publication devoted to the logging and forestry industry available on our website that talks a lot about how things have changed over the decades and kind of where we are today. This is another kind of thing that was of interest. This is federal data from the CFOI program about unintentional drug overdoses. Surprisingly, this has ballooned quite significantly over the past 5 years, where in 2011 there were only 73 cases, and now in 2016 there were 217 cases. So it's a pretty significant jump over a 5-year period. Homicides is another area that's also had quite a significant jump over the past 5 years as well. I believe in 2016 there were about 500 homicides, which was like the highest number since 2011, at least. So, so there are some areas where we're seeing increasing trends that we wouldn't necessarily expect. Another thing that we want to look at for our Oregon data once we get this new program up and running is racial disproportionality and disparity. For example, Hispanic workers nationally, we've seen have a much higher rate of fatal injury than all other workers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, this population in some cases will have language barriers or immigration issues that will ultimately basically make them less safe in the workplace. And so it's an area that we want to look at to see in Oregon if we're seeing the same trends and how we can address that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about for just like a couple minutes is just some of the kind of stuff that we do with the agency on the more application side in relation to fatalities. And one of those is inspections and investigations that Oregon OSHA does. So Karen, you want to talk a little bit about one of those investigations?
Okay. This was a case where it wasn't a workers' comp case because she was a contractor and she just wasn't covered by, and there wasn't really an employer. She was there working with this other individual who had a different company. They were falling large fir trees, and as you know, fir trees get really big. When one of the fir trees fell, it grazed, kind of brushed by some other alder trees, about 5 alder trees. At that point, nothing happened. So she moved forward to delimb the fir that had fallen. And as she was using the chainsaw, she may or may not have been an issue because she couldn't hear, one of the alders behind her fell and struck her on the head. She was wearing a hard hat, but it didn't help. It pushed her face down. And she died of head injuries. So this was a case where Oregon OSHA did an investigation, even though there was no workers' comp coverage, even though she was an independent contractor. They said that he had some control. He had more knowledge. He had years of experience over her, should have done more to keep her safe. And he ended up with a pretty serious violation. It was a pretty hefty fine from this one, which can no way make up the fatality. But it's a good lesson in knowing, just because you have the paperwork and the law saying you're not responsible doesn't mean you're not ultimately responsible. So that's that case.
Yeah, what many people may not know, unless you're an employer, is, and hopefully all employers know this, is that fatalities in the workplace actually need to be reported, legally should be reported to Oregon OSHA within 8 hours of the fatality. And so that report will allow Oregon OSHA to determine whether or not an investigation is warranted. And generally speaking, they investigate all the fatalities. It's 8 hours for a fatality. It's 24 hours for other injuries, inpatient hospitalizations, and other types of injuries. But if it's a fatality or if it's a catastrophe, and a catastrophe is defined as 3 or more injured workers, seriously injured workers, then it has to be reported within 8 hours. And it is the employer's responsibility to make that report. I have actually seen some cases where the employer assumed that, for example, the sheriff's department or the medical examiner would report to Oregon OSHA, but it is actually ultimately the employer's responsibility to make that report. And then based on that report, they determine whether or not it's within the scope of their jurisdiction, and if it is, then they will do an investigation. And that investigation may or may not result in any types of citations or penalties as a result of the hazards in the workplace that may or may not have resulted in that fatality. So those inspections are a very important part of the overall safety and health work that we do. One of the other things that we do related to workers' comp fatalities is we actually do work related to the Worker Memorial Day. Worker Memorial Day is an event that happens every year. April 28th actually is Worker Memorial Day. And there are ceremonies and commemorations across the nation related to workers who have died on the job. And in fact, every year right outside this building, there's usually a ceremony that happens that we participate in that commemorates workers that have died here in Oregon. In fact, if you go right outside our building, over on the Capitol Mall side, you'll see there is a memorial set up there specifically for workers who have died on the job. One of the other things that we do is our agency has money for a scholarship program that's specifically devoted to surviving family members of workers who have died on the job or been seriously injured. And so every year we award scholarships to those students for their college education. So that was it for me. We have time for questions, and if you ever want to find us, this is how you find us. So thank you. Any additional questions? Yeah, please, Shep.
You were saying that homicides have jumped a lot in the recent years. I think you were saying like 2015, and I was wondering if mass shootings are included in this category, or
right. So the question was, I'd mentioned earlier that there's been an increase in homicides over the years, and the question was whether or not mass shootings are included as part of that. And the answer, James, correct me if I'm wrong, is that yes, they are. I think the only significant event that I can think of that was not included in the CFOI counts is the 9/11 event, because of the fact that that was a pretty big outlier that people were aware of. But generally speaking, mass shootings and things of that nature are included. Yes.
Thanks. So, I don't know how to say it now. So depending on how you count them, there's a couple dozen fatalities, 3 or 4 dozen fatalities a year among workers, people in the workplace. But people die apparently outside of work by the scores. Right? It seems like being at work is the least likely way to die. Why do we? At what point do we decide? Oh, it's been going down. It's way down, and it's been going down for years and years. Right. When do we decide work is safe enough, and we should focus everybody's efforts on things that
crazy people who climb the mountain.
Other ways that people die, or just other things. People have other problems at work besides dying.
They study those too.
All right, so to paraphrase, Dawn says that dying is not nearly as important as, no, I'm kidding. So, but no, that is a really valid point. I mean, obviously we've made some pretty significant strides over the years, and the rate of occupational fatalities has decreased, which is great. Obviously, we don't want to see it go back up, for sure. And, as Michael Wood and many others have said, Michael Wood being the administrator of Oregon OSHA, and as many others say, every year, one is too many. One is, too many, right? So the question is, at what point do we decide to divert efforts to other things? Well, one of the things that I think about occupational fatalities is that even as it's declining, it is a really good indicator of kind of where we are in the state of occupational safety and health. Some of the other indicators that we look at, such as injuries and illnesses, there are other factors that can, and I'm thinking about this from a data perspective, right? There are other factors that affect that number, and as you're very much well aware, like the number of back injuries every year, which is one of the most significant work in terms of quantity, significant work-related injuries that happens in the state, well, in the nation. There are other nuances in policy decisions and insurance decisions that determine whether or not that particular injury gets counted or not, right? Whereas fatalities, it's a little more clean-cut, it's a little clearer. And so while we could look at the number of back injuries per year and see that decline and say, yeah, but it could because we made the door smaller, it made it harder for those claims to get accepted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With fatalities, it's a little harder to say that same thing because there's just not that many barriers to, for example, a claim getting accepted or a fatality being counted in some of our other surveillance programs too. So from just strictly a data perspective, it's still a really great metric because it's cleaner in a lot of those ways. Now that being said, from a policy perspective, there's obviously lots of reasons why occupational fatalities is an area of interest. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not the trend of injuries versus fatalities, if they are the same. There are hazards that certainly will create an injury that will very rarely create a fatality, right? Slips, trips, and falls at work, you wet floor, that kind of thing. Those will definitely cause an injury, but the number of times that that's going to cause a fatality is pretty slim. But other serious injuries are more directly correlated to fatalities and stuff. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble now. Go ahead.
Question. When we talk about prevention, things such as availability of medical care or improvements in medical care available, does this count as prevention, or is this just an external factor impacting fatality count?
So the question was, does the accessibility and to medical care, does that in any way count towards prevention efforts? And I would say obviously it does. That being said though, I think with fatal cases in particular, a lot of the ones that we see are pretty instantaneous, and so there really isn't much medical intervention that can actually happen.
Because in the older times, people may have died from the things that can be prevented these days, right?
Right. So maybe at this point, now we've kind of culled out all the ones that could have been saved through medical care, and now what we have left are the more instantaneous. Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's also true, just as a little caveat though, that some of the other fatalities that we see are, how should I phrase this, as a result of medical care. There are certainly cases, opioid addiction and overdoses that we see, and also things that happen through surgeries or things like that, which do get counted in some of our case counts, for sure. So.
If someone is taking opiates because they hurt their back at work and they die of an overdose, they might get counted as a workplace injury or workplace death?
Yes, they would. They absolutely would. They would not, generally speaking, they usually don't get counted in our workers' compensation claims counts because we're counting whether or not the fatality portion of that injury is counted, and usually they don't get accepted fatality benefits as a result of that. But for something like the CFOI program, the FACE program, and our new workplace fatality program, we absolutely would count that. Because there's a correlation between the injury and the eventual fatality. So, Max.
Know that we're running out of time here, but one thing that really fascinates me in this topic, and it's really just challenging to think about, is occupational illnesses and fatalities that result from that, because I can just imagine the challenges of collecting the data, as well as kind of assessing where are we now as of 10 years ago, 50 years ago, and what are the effects on our regulatory structure and improving that and prevention and all that. Could you just say maybe a word or two about any challenges of collecting the data, or where are we at right now? Do we have really good indicators that have been developed in recent times?
Right, so the question was in relation to occupational illnesses, and particularly fatalities related from occupational illnesses. Do we have any good indicators, and what are the challenges to that? And the short answer is not really, and there's a lot. There are a lot of challenges to capturing information on occupational illnesses, and as you can imagine, there's a pretty long pipeline between the illness and them being recognized as a work-related illness. One of those is that the worker themselves has to recognize it as a work-related illness, and there's many illnesses that may present as something that would just be naturally occurring that the doctor or the worker would not actually connect back to their work. So for example, one of the areas that I'm working in right now for Oregon OSHA is in relation to manganese, which exposure to manganese will actually, if overexposure, will result in development of Parkinson's-like symptoms and other neurological issues. Obviously that happens after decades of work-related exposure, and so having the doctor recognized that it was their years of welding that caused that particular illness, and then for them to next cross that next barrier that they have an accepted claim, that they go through the workers' comp system and that gets an accepted claim, or it's somehow other, some their surveillance system picks it up. It is. It's a really long slog, and it's really hard to pick those up. And so that's why a lot of the counts that you see are actually more estimates as opposed to actual surveillance programs. That being said, there was a recent, I think it was the NSA. No, that's not right. Anyway, there was shoot, I forget. There was a recent work group, though, to look at ways to improve some of these surveillance systems. In particular, that was one of the things that they looked at was occupational illnesses. And I cannot remember off the top of my head the name of the agency that did it. But I can send that to you once I find it. So, yeah. Real quick, last one. Yeah.
So is that sort of the same bucket you might put, say, tobacco exposure on this job? Which, Oregon has a great Clean Air Act, Indoor Clean Air Act, compared to a lot of states. But,
right.
So
Yeah.
where does that fit in?
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting that you bring that up because I don't think that's one that we actually think about very much. I think it probably falls in line with a lot of the thinking that was traditionally done over the years about transportation accidents, right? It's one of those things that a person was driving, the employer didn't have any direct control over that. People drive every day, and so they just happened to be working at the time that they, And so I think tobacco exposure would probably fall in that same category of kind of how we've thought about it. That being said, if it was an area that we decided to focus on, I think we'd have a lot of the same issues that we do with other occupational illnesses. It'd be really challenging to collect that information. So, all right, well, thank you so much. I'm gonna go